Every few months, sometimes a month, sometimes 4 or 5 months, I have to empty my dustbin. It's the box that collects the sawdust from my dust collection system in the shop. And the way I made this dustbin, there's a door on the front, and when you open it, you can see sort of the section of time through the dustbin. So all of the different projects sort of show up as different color bands. And usually when I open this, I post a photo online and I get all kinds of comments about how I should save this and how I should cast it in resin and how I should make it into art. And yeah, that's all a good idea, but how do you actually do that? How do you do that with a substance that's about as fragile as you can get? Sort of just sawdust stacked on top of itself. So one of my early attempts was to mask out the sides of the dustbin and mix up some resin and try and spray that resin onto the face of the sawdust. And I kind of screwed this up because I didn't test my little squirt bottle, as I didn't want to get water into the mix with the resin. That's really bad. You get bubbles. So I'm not sure if the squirt bottle didn't work because it was resin or because the squirt bottle just didn't work. So all I could get was a straight stream instead of a spray. It completely did not work. And basically, I only get one chance every few months to experiment with this. Once I've wrecked the surface, then I have to think of something for the next time. The next idea, and I'll have to give a little credit to my friend Brian for coming up with this idea, was to make a box and put that box in the sawdust bin before it's full and let the sawdust fill up the box within the bin and hopefully get the layers of color to develop within the box. Then I would have a box of sawdust that I could do something with. So I thought I should make a cylindrical container to put into the sawdust bin. I cut some circles out on the CNC. And I wanted to wrap the sides with plywood. I was working with this scrap plywood I had pulled out of our basement. And I cut a bunch of relief cuts into it to make it curve around the circle. What I found is this old plywood is way too brittle. It just breaks apart. I found a newer piece of plywood that I could use. One of the things that I figured out in doing this, maybe this is a known woodworking thing, but what I found is that when you're trying to bend the plywood with a bunch of relief cuts, it works better to have the grain on the outside surface of the plywood be perpendicular to the cuts. I had thought it would be the reverse, but that's actually not true. What you want is the strength on the outside of the plywood to be able to hold that curve. With the newer piece of plywood, the curve worked just fine. Then I had to cut it to the right length. It's hard because you have to make it the right length around the circle, and you can't cut it too short, or you have to start over and make the piece all over again. I cut off little bits at a time, and I managed to sort of sneak up on that length. I can put it together and make sure it's going to fall into place. Sort of a dry fit, I guess. Then I can add some glue and clamp it in place. And the hose clamps worked perfectly. I had made a ring to go around the top, but I found I really didn't need it. In fact, really, I could have not even bothered with the glue. I could have made this, put it together with the hose clamps, and then fill it with sawdust and fill it with resin, and the glue wouldn't even be necessary. In doing it this way, I could take the hose clamps off and put it back in the dustbin. But that's really not a big deal. I did think before I put it in the dustbin that I should make a little bottom for the cylinder so that it doesn't tip over in the dustbin. My fear was I would put it into the dustbin, it would tip over with the air movement in the bin, and after several months I would have collected an air pocket. In making this little cylinder, I didn't want to use any metal fasteners as I was going to put this on the lathe and turn it in the end. So I wanted it to just be wood and glue. Now when the dustbin has a little bit of sawdust in it, I can open it and set my cylinders into the dustbin. I made 2, just sort of for good measure. And they're in place, and I cleaned up a little bit, and then I can close the door again. When using a cyclone separator, you want an airtight box on the bottom for the dust.
Several months later.
It's time to dig out the dustbin. I've also gotten a lot of comments on why I have it set up this way. I guess this is just the way that I built it, and it would probably be easier to have it go into a container, but then it wouldn't have the same volume to fill, so I would have to clean it out more often. And it still has to get into the yard debris container somehow. And this really isn't that hard, shoveling the dust collector out. I was careful as I got lower down in the dust, and I could pull out my cylinders carefully. These were sort of objects that I couldn't accidentally tip over or knock over or break. They were sort of these delicate objects now because the time spent in the dustbin was now part of the object. So I put them in a somewhat safe place in the shop to start thinking about how to do something with these cylinders. I cleaned up a little bit, and I can close the dustbin back up again. I made a little test piece with some sawdust. This is not one of the cylinders, and it's just sawdust with resin poured into it, but not stirring the resin and sawdust together. And it worked actually a little better than I thought it would. The container of sawdust I had, the smaller pieces of sawdust had kind of worked their way to the bottom. So the material on the bottom was a little more like MDF, and the material on the top was a little more like what I wanted. So I decided to just go ahead and use one of my cylinders and give it a try. And for this one, I heated the mold and the sawdust, and I warmed up the resin. I poured the resin into 2 separate containers. Once I had everything warmed up, I mixed the resin together. Now this looks like enough resin. I was kind of guessing on how much resin I was going to need. First, I decided I'd make a little tape rim for the cylinder. I should have done that before I mixed the resin together. And I slowly poured the resin in, and it took it all up. It did bubble a bunch. I think if I do this again, I'll make a pointy stick that I can run down the side of the cylinder to help get the resin down to the bottom. I tried vibrating it with a sander, but that didn't seem like it really worked that well, so I just tapped it with my hand. And I can put it in the pressure pot. The pressure pot was going to be part of this video, but it became a project in itself. It has its own video from a few weeks ago. And I can put it under pressure, and this should make the bubbles smaller and hopefully force the resin in around the sawdust. At this point, I had pulled it out and done a second pour on the top, which is why the top is filled in. I wanted to see if there was resin in the bottom, and I decided I could use a hole on the lathe in the center of the piece. So I drilled a hole right in the center of the bottom to see if there was resin in the bottom. And there was resin in the bottom, and it seemed to be nice and solid. It was even kind of the big pieces of sawdust from the top. So things were looking good at this point. I wanted to cut the bottom off, but first I needed to sand the top so that the piece would fit on my bandsaw. I was wondering at this point how to mount it on the lathe, and I had been thinking I would glue a block to the bottom, but I just went with putting it in some big jaws for the chuck. So my thought was to make this into a sphere. That seemed like sort of the most straightforward thing to do with this chunk of resin and sawdust. So with the piece in the chuck, I could do one side almost completely and do most of the other side. I had drawn a line in the center, so I knew approximately what to remove. The resin is definitely harder than wood, and it was slow going. And it dulls the tool a lot quicker. I was having to sharpen a lot more often. I'm turning a big piece of frozen ground chuck. When I turned the piece around, I thought I would turn off the piece of plywood that had been on the bottom, but I decided that was going to take a while and I could just cut that off on the bandsaw. So that's what I did. I could tilt the table on the bandsaw, then just go around the ring on the base and cut that off. That was much quicker than doing it on the lathe. I could finish up that side. I had been holding the tool kind of at an angle and kind of using the sides of the edge on the bowl gouge. But what I found once I got going into the sphere was that if I held the bowl gouge almost horizontally and cut with the sides of the tool and used the bowl gouge almost like a scraper, that gave me a really nice cut and a really nice finish. It didn't take off very much, but it made it really nice to do the turning. It was slow going, but it felt right. So you can kind of see the way I'm holding the tool here. So I'm not cutting with the tip, but the sides of the sharp part of the bowl gouge. As slow as the turning went, the sanding went really quickly. Part of that was because I had a good finish on the sphere from the turning, but also I think the resin just takes well to sanding. So I started with, I think, a fairly high, I think maybe 220 sandpaper, and worked my way through. I think these, I forget what they're called. Are they micro meshes? But they go up to 32,000, I think. If folks have some methods for getting a nice polish on the final finish, I would love to hear about that. I got it pretty good, but I think it could be a little better. I tried running it on the buffer, and that did seem to help a little. So I think on this buffing wheel, it's just the cotton buffing wheel. There's no compound on this or anything. So you can see the layers of the sawdust, which is really nice. It'd be nice to maybe get a little bit shinier finish on it. And it does have little voids from the pour. And I'm wondering about how to fill those. It's kind of cool just the way it is. It kind of looks like travertine. Someone mentioned using vacuum bagging, and I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. My thought is that I put a bag around the sphere, put some resin in, and then suck the air out, and the bag will sort of push the resin into all the little holes in the surface. So I think this was a good start in trying to preserve the history in the dustbin. Thanks for watching.